The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweigh the dangers which are cited to justify it.
Hello, this is Dane Wigington with Global Alert News with GeoEngineeringWatch.org radio for Saturday, November 14th, 2015. For those who listen to the internet, this broadcast goes out live on KQMS in Northern California, Saturday mornings at 6 a.m. It's a commercial-free hour because it's paid for out of pocket. Because I don't want to have distracting commercials in the middle of dire data that's important for people to understand and consider, and it's hard to grasp the gravity of that data between commercials for snow skiing or hot dogs. So the bottom line is we try to make the most of this hour, cover the most ground we possibly can. A quick reminder, today, Saturday, November 14th, 3 p.m. at the Reading Library, there'll be a free viewing of 9/11 Architects and Engineers for Truth, a groundbreaking documentary put out by over 2,300 of the world's top architects and engineers who are officially and on the record disputing the government narrative on what happened that day. If you don't want to face this issue, then don't come. But if you want to know what you don't know, if you're willing to face data that has not been given to us by our government, again by some of the world's top experts putting their careers on the line to put this data out. This is an extremely compelling documentary. It's a free viewing. There'll be other informational material there for free. Also, it's a free event. So if you really are willing to face the truth and try to find out what you don't know, come to this event. Again, 3 p.m. at the Reading Library. Industrial society is in its death throes. This is something most people don't want to face. Who would? But if we don't, if we turn our back on what's unfolding around us, are we truly fulfilling our responsibility to our children, for example, and to the planet that sustains us? We're not. It's our responsibility to face what's unfolding around us. Infrastructure is disintegrating, resources are waiting. If you don't believe this, remember this broadcast in the weeks and the months to come. More in the story later in the broadcast. Again, trouble's not out off on the horizon somewhere. It's not somewhere in the future. It's kicking in the door right now. What stupidity with all this going on, with so many converging catastrophes around us. And again, to Americans, many Americans, this is not so visible yet because all the chain stores are still open, all the fast food stores are still open, there's still gas at the fuel pump. They don't have to face the fact that salmon fisheries are collapsing, marine ecosystems are collapsing, crops are collapsing around the globe. The poles are disintegrating, the Arctic is disintegrating, certainly. We have cod fishery collapse on the East Coast. We've lost 60% of all wildlife in the last 40 years, but most people driving around in their brand new car financed for who knows how long with no interest and nothing down, that's not really reality to them. The CD player still works. They can still grab a Jamba Juice and go on their way, and everything's fine. But for how long? For how long? Well, all this is going on in the bigger horizon. Just a few quick headlines from our mainstream media circus of stupidity. What we're supposed to consider headlines. Famous gum wall suffers cleaning. How important could that possibly be? Soap actor dies after car accident. Do we really need to know that? NBA superstar wasn't good until age 17. What bearing does that have on the big picture? Tattoo prank fools GOP and media. More distractions of stupidity. Final headline, NFLer blows up over alleged slur. Sports. We could go on with the political idiocracy that's on every single day. How long are we going to have to suffer with that while so much is happening around the globe? So many systems are collapsing, natural systems on which our lives depend, and we have to watch this political theater. How many think that there's any difference? At this point, how many still believe that there's any difference between any of these candidates, any parties, whatever their promises are? It's nothing but theater. How long does it take for the American population to get that through their heads? The elections are frauds. It's an illusion, a delusion. We don't have paperless voting machines so that we have legitimate elections. The entire system is rigged from top to bottom. What does it take for people to understand that? And take a good look at any one of these candidates. I don't care who it is. And honestly ask yourself if you think that person is truly going to change the world. They're nothing but stage props. That's all, in a system that's rigged from top to bottom. Now, our lives depend on weather. Without the Earth's life support systems and weather, we're not going to be here very long. Does anyone have the right to play God with the weather? Now, the global geoengineering continues to make an already bad climate situation exponentially worse. As I've always stated, this issue I'll cover a lot because without the weather, without clean air, without uncontaminated soils, it's game over for us on planet Earth. Few people seem to notice that there's very little blue skies left, almost never. Skies are generally very hazy as all these particulates fall to Earth, and that's exactly what they're doing. We know this, again, from lab testing. We're not guessing. A decimated climate system is increasing drought and deluge and, again, a complete contamination of the planet. These are the gifts of geoengineering. Geoengineering is the epitome, the absolute epitome of human insanity. The unimaginable destructive use of the weather as a weapon and the attempt to use these weather manipulation programs to hide the damage already done to the climate system. Again, with the same destructive programs that cause much of the damage in the first place. Is that not the definition of insanity? Then, of course, as mentioned, there's the total contamination of the planet. And this contamination, as I stated earlier, this is not speculation, it's not theory, it's not conjecture, but it's proven with countless lab tests from locations around the globe, about 70 in Northern California from Basic Lab. And by the way, there's a new owner at Basic Lab, the state-certified lab in Reading. I have been told by clients of that lab that this new owner is now telling clients that it's normal to have aluminum in rain. That's how Orwellian our world has become. I don't know this new owner. I knew the last owner. Nice man. He agreed that these programs were going on. I'll say that on the record because I've had some pretty long sit-downs with the former owner of Basic Lab in Reading. But the new owner is, I have been told, I can't say this with certainty, I haven't been told in my face, but I've been told by people who are very upstanding citizens of this community that they were told by Basic Lab that it's normal to have aluminum in your rain. Since when? Since when? The big lie about aluminum being common to have everywhere because it's a common element needs to be understood and exposed. Aluminum does not exist in the environment in free form naturally. Period. Should not be in our air and our rain. Yes, it's in our soils. It's locked up to other elements. It doesn't float around in free form, in bioavailable form, but it does now. Understand that and listen to that statement. Aluminum is in your air in bioavailable free form. We know that from lab testing, from precipitation testing. So with all this going on in our skies, contaminating every breath we take, what about the weather right now? The exact antithesis of what we've seen in previous years. Previous years we've seen the western U.S. frying while the eastern U.S. freezes. At this particular point in time, we have the exact opposite scenario. And both scenarios are meteorologically ridiculous, historically ridiculous, but why don't our meteorologists say anything? Because it's a very bad career decision to say anything. If you work for the government, it may be even much more than a bad career decision. And we know this, again, because we have people like former CIA officer Kevin Shipp, whose report I published at GeoEngineeringWatch.org, telling us exactly what government agencies do to those who speak out about things the government doesn't want them to speak out about. Why would that be a surprise? When we have mass government surveillance also illegal, that our society seems to have accepted, why would it be a surprise nobody's speaking out? And that's a common excuse for so many people. If this was going on, they say, we would have heard about it. Really? From who? Who has the courage to speak out? There's a few former government scientists, and I know them, at least the primary ones that have spoken out, former Forest Service, former Fish and Game, former USDA. Their testimonies are on record for anyone who wants to see. Unfortunately, most people don't. So what's happening with the weather right now? Again, massive aerosolization, spraying of fine particulates for climate modification purposes as these fronts come in. Very different from historical storms. How many people remember the historical storms that circulated in? You could see these low pressures lined up off the coast. No more. You typically see mass drifting amorphous layers of aerosolized moisture and murk flowing in a very different manner than the historical norm. We don't have the strong squalls of rain coming in as we used to have. Now, we may this winter. That can change any point in time. This is not a fixed scenario we're in. Climate engineering requires daily application of these particulates, and so far they've been very consistent, but that can change at any point in time. But the bottom line is the storm's very different, the precipitation is very different. Where I live, northeast of Redding, we used to get 2.5 times the rain that Redding gets, no more. Now we get 20-30% more because the aerosols don't allow the rain to precipitate out from orographic enhancement, from topography. Everything's changed. Everything. How many have noticed the dead leaves in previous years that hang on the trees? In some cases, all winter long. Leaves that were never released from the tree, from the abscission hormone, which comes from the cold, they just hung there, dead, on the trees. Why don't people notice this? Why don't people notice how many dead trees there are? Period. So when we see the dead leaves on the trees, what's falling on them? What's hitting those leaves to cause them to die on the tree? Is there some sort of defoliant also in the fall? Because we see this at a certain point in time in the fall, and we know such chemicals exist because the farmers are using them on their trees to force them into dormancy because it's not getting cold enough anymore. Not cold enough. So we have record warm temperatures in so many places, and still so many people are in denial. As of November 7th, we had temperatures in the Arctic Ocean, in some locations, 24.7 degrees above normal. That's an absolute cataclysm. Absolute cataclysm. Is media reporting on this? No. What do they show us? I just watched about a 20-minute segment of one of the biggest mouths in the world, Donald Trump. And anybody who thinks that Donald Trump is going to save the day, you're living in a delusion, an absolute delusion. He's simply an actor in the play like all the rest of the actors in the play. Doesn't matter. They're not going to change a thing. They're not meant to change a thing. They're simply meant to distract you. And if you wonder how some of these cool downs occur after California's been so hot for so long, and then suddenly in the course of a day or two, the temperatures will drop 50 degrees precipitously. Welcome to chemical ice nucleation for weather modification. I didn't make that term up. We have patents for these processes. Look at GeoEngineeringWatch.org, where we have those patents published. Why would they make a patent if they weren't going to use it? How else would we have astounding ice nucleation events just documented in a post put up Thursday, the 12th, still on GeoEngineeringWatch.org, with photographs, astounding photographs of ice-nucleated material, massive ice boulders washed up on beaches around the globe, an unprecedented phenomenon that happens from this chemically nucleated material that tends to expand around itself, and as the wave action makes these spheres, they wash up on the beaches. This is historically unprecedented. And how does this happen? Some of these ice boulders, and again, I challenge anybody listening, please don't believe me. Please just look it up. Abandon your preconceptions and your biases, and please just look it up. Look up Lake Michigan ice boulders, and you'll see photographs that will shock you of what's occurred on Lake Michigan in the last few years. 75-pound ice boulders covering the lake. How does that happen? And especially how does that happen when it's occurred at lake temperatures of 40 degrees? 40. How does that happen? Chemical ice nucleation. Remember, your first aid kit sits on the shelf, 20 years, you mix the chemicals, you have ice. There are patents for chemical nucleation processes to be sprayed over moisture in storms to create this phenomenon. Chinese scientists openly admitted they were doing it. Look that one up. Look up Chinese scientists create artificial snowstorms. You'll see Fox News even covered that one. So, again, we have weather modification programs now. They can't cool the whole country at once. There's not enough resources. The climate system's too far off the rails. So we have this weather whiplash, flip-flopping, East Coast frozen, West Coast frying previous years. Now we have the exact opposite scenario going on. So people need to wake up to this weather whack-a-mole that's going on. Very toxic, destructive weather whack-a-mole. Let's get to a few headlines. The Telegraph of London. How our megacities will slip under the waves with 2-degree rise in temperatures. Study shows how large parts of New York, London, Shanghai, and other cities will be submerged as a result of rising sea levels. Now, a lot of people hate Al Gore so much they'll walk away from this without even doing a bit of research. That's a mistake, because this scenario just described is not off on the horizon. It's here. It's already happening. We already have islands going under in the South Pacific. We have Florida pumping out almost every high tide. It's happening now, and it's happening at exponentially accelerating rates. So on the 2-degree temperature rise, which a lot of people think is off in the future, it's happened, it's already here. Not just 2 degrees Fahrenheit, but we are likely perhaps 2 degrees centigrade above baseline. Humans haven't existed on the planet above 3 or 3.5 degrees C, depending on the study you look at. We're in uncharted territory, period. And even though official records and official disclosures don't state that it's that warm yet, I and others monitor temperatures in various locations. One friend of mine with the Union of Concerned Scientists has also participated in this, seeing about a 4 to 5 degree underreporting of official high temperatures. Now, depending on how uniform that is, it appears by all available data it's much hotter than we're being told. Why wouldn't they tell us? Why wouldn't they tell us at this point? And a lot of people think they're trumpeting this alarmism of climate warming to try to sell carbon credits, and some are, I agree, and carbon credits are a sham, an absolute sham, that a lot of environmental groups want to buy into, and I hope they wake up, because that won't fix anything. We're already through the guardrail, period. That's just a simple distraction. We need to do a lot more than that, starting with the stopping of climate engineering. But this sea level rise is happening now. In fact, the top experts on the planet recently stated, and please look this up as well, sea levels are rising 10 times faster than the previous worst case scenario. Can't hide that for very long, can you? Another headline, a scorching earth threatens U.S. agriculture. From London, a deadly mix of prolonged drought and wildfire driven by climate change could do more than just lay waste to crops and woodlands in the western U.S. It could scorch the earth and trigger even greater levels of soil erosion. Well, that's a really redundant statement in the sense it's almost like saying if it gets hot, ice will melt. Well, we all know that. I mean, a lot of these journalists and so-called experts make statements that are so profoundly simplistic and obvious that why do we need them to make these statements? I've cited before there was a couple dozen PhDs studying the Greenland ice for several years to come to the conclusion the ice is melting and flowing into the water. Well, no kidding. This is our science society at this point. I'm not labeling all of them. There are some good people there that are simply afraid to speak out, but they need to be much more courageous than they've been, because the water's up around our neck at this point. So Joel Sankey, a researcher at the U.S. Geological Survey, told the Geological Society of America at their annual meeting in Baltimore, Maryland, that by 2050, an increase in wildfires may double soil erosion in some western states. As a consequence, soil would blow or be washed into the watercourse. Again, what a ridiculously simplistic statement. One, by 2050, we're already there at 2015. Forest fires may double. Canada lost 600% more forest-to-forest fires last year. 600%. That statistic carries in many places around the globe. Siberia lost 100 million acres. Why do we need these completely downplayed reports that some people have convinced themselves are alarmist. These reports aren't alarmist. They're so far short of how dire reality is that they're meaningless. Such a statement is meaningless that if the forests burn, there may be more soil erosion. Who doesn't know that? Why do we need an expert to tell us that? It's already happening. So look past the simplistic reports by so-called experts that are so afraid of losing their jobs, they won't say anything that could possibly truly cause alarm in anyone. So as the biosphere implodes, and it is imploding, it's absolutely imploding, and anybody who doesn't believe it is simply not doing any research or looking at any reality. They're watching Donald Trump or Ben Carson or one of the other clowns in the circus. When the environment implodes, the economy will follow. Period. Another headline. These are all new headlines, by the way. This is from Associated Press. Trade slowdown points to world recession risk, Watchdog says, by Greg Keller. Paris. A slowdown in international trade could be the harbinger of a new recession for the world's leading economies. A leading global policy organization warned on Monday. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development says trade figures are worrisome because the stagnating or declining rates of trade seen this year, quote, have in the past been associated with global recession. Again, very simplistic statements because those in power feel that society can't digest anything, so they break things down in the most ridiculously simple terms. Obviously, if things slow down enough, there's a recession. We all know that. This report continues. In its World Economic Outlook issued Monday, the Paris-based group projected global trade growth at 2% this year, improving to 3.6% next year. Why would it improve next year? I'm just asking. Because we've been trained to believe that you can look backward at a graph, at a chart, and that chart has a life of its own, somehow, magically. That you can look backward and say, well, this happened 20 years ago, so that's what's going to happen next year. You can't do that. You can't do that. We're in a completely different scenario. We are in uncharted water. Why would the economy grow next year when the biosphere, what supports all life, is imploding? How can the economy grow when Earth's life support systems are imploding? So let's get past the ridiculous statements at that point of the report. Next paragraph. In only 5 years of the past 50 has global trade grown at 2% or less, and each time has coincided with a world economic downturn, said Angel Gurria, the OECD's Secretary General. Again, here's this quote-unquote expert looking backward at a chart and somehow magically trying to convince us that that chart has a life going forward, has any meaning going forward. It doesn't. We're in uncharted waters. The report continues again, quote, trade should be growing at about double the speed of growth of the world economy because trade is always a locomotive, Guerrero said. Instead, the OECD predicted the world economy would grow 2% or less. Now, very simple question. How does industrialized, militarized society grow perpetually, looting, plundering, and pillaging the planet with finite resources that in many respects are already exhausted? How does that happen? It can't happen. It's not going to happen. And we're hitting the wall now. We're through the guardrail now. Another headline. We have never seen global trade collapse this dramatically outside of a major recession. This is by Michael Snyder, November 9th, 2015. Some people are opening their eyes a little bit. Even these economists, even these journalists, still are completely blind to the bigger picture. Somehow, economies exist in and of themselves without the need for an environment or a functioning biosphere, which is, of course, false. But they don't seem to take that into account. This report by Michael Snyder continues. If you have been watching for the next major global economic downturn, you can now stop waiting because it has officially arrived. Never before in history has global trade collapsed this dramatically outside of a major worldwide recession. And this makes perfect sense. When global economic activity is increasing, there is more demand for goods and services around the world. And when global economic activity is decreasing, there is less demand for goods and services around the world. Again, these statements are so unbelievably simplistic. How can the average American why does the average American need such a simplistic explanation? So far this year, the report continues, global trade is down about 8.4%. That's huge, by the way. And over the past 30 days, the Baltic Dry Index has been absolutely plummeting. For those of you that don't know what the BDI is, the Baltic Dry Index, that's the most untarnished economic indicator in the world. That's all global dry shipping. And it is virtually off a cliff in the basement. If it's not shipping, the illusion of an economy is nothing more than smoke and mirrors. It always has been. But that illusion is becoming all but impossible to maintain as the biosphere collapses. And it is collapsing. Let's check another headline from Zero Hedge, a very well-known international financial site, about the Baltic Dry Index. Headline says this, it's official. The Baltic Dry Index has crashed to its lowest November level in history. Again, Baltic Dry Index, dry shipping from anyone to anyone, most untarnished economic indicator on the planet, period. This report states, 2015 has been, quote, an odd year. Typically this time of year sees demand picking up amid holiday inventory stacking and measures of global trade, such as the Baltic Dry Index rise from midsummer to Thanksgiving. This year it has not. In fact, it has plummeted as the world's economic engines slow, and the reality under the covers of the global stock markets suggests a massive deflationary wave, parentheses, following a massive malinvestment boom, in parentheses. At a level of 631, this is the lowest cost for Baltic Dry Freight Index in history. Now, that's about, I think about 6 or 7% of its peak. Think about that. That's a massive decline. There is huge losses taking place at that rate. Container ships are being scrapped at record rates. How many know that? They're scrapping them for the steel. People have no clue what's going on around them, and those in power have made every effort to make sure the public has no clue, to make it appear everything's fine, shelves are stocked up, lots of new cars for nothing down, no interest for who knows how long. Just trying to keep the herd happy for as long as possible. We need to wake up. Another last headline from Zero Hedge as well. Global trade in free fall. China container freight at record low. Rail traffic tumbles. Trucking slows. Think of these headlines. Do we see this on CNN? No, we don't see this. We don't see headlines about the crashing economy, the crashing biosphere, the completely imploding fisheries from salmon to cod, crashing crops. We don't see any of this because the power structure wants to keep the population pacified as long as possible while they're digging in. A few last headlines about jobs cuts. Just a few from many headlines. These are current headlines, by the way, all of them. Zurich plans to cut 440 jobs at UK. Big banks cut 1,475 jobs to maintain profits. Australia. More job cuts loom as market faces squeeze. Malaysia. Oil giant Chevron announces big job cuts amid slump in global prices. Nigerian oil companies cut 120,000 jobs. 120,000. If you think things are bad in places in Africa now, what happens when what little commerce there is there completely implodes? It's happening right now. We don't see this on our news. Again, it's political theater. It's some story they dug out of a hat somewhere and dramatized for weeks at a time. And most Americans so far, I'm sorry to say, have been okay with this. They want to believe nothing is going on out in the bigger picture. But it is. And ignoring it won't make it go away. The global industrialized and militarized society is an illusionary ship of titanic proportions. With completely orchestrated facts and figures, the global power structure has kept this Titanic afloat for an astoundingly long time. But the water's now coming over the deck. And again, I state this emphatically. There can be no global economy when the biosphere implodes, which is happening now and accelerating by the day. There's no saving or salvaging this ship. It was doomed from the start. The paradigm we have all known was never sustainable. But even now, so few want to face this fact. Most people get extremely angry when confronted with this kind of truth. If you dare to expose what others don't want to hear, be prepared to lose relationships. I know about that firsthand on a very large scale. But don't turn back. Don't turn away from the truth, no matter what resistance or ridicule you're subjected to by those that lack the courage to face reality. As the saying goes, stand fast, to thine own self be true. That's not a selfish statement. It simply means never ignore your conscience. Never. Your will is all that belongs to you. It's all that any of us own. If you abandon that because of some pressure from the herd, then you've given up all that you own. That's a bad choice. I'm fully aware of the fact that many will listen to this Northern California broadcast with complete skepticism and denial. Many will try to convince themselves that it's all nonsense, that the fossil fuel fiesta, in the words of James Kunstler, will magically continue into an infinite future of permanent expansion and plunder on a finite planet with finite resources. That's dwindling resources, by the way, and a planet on which the former miraculous balance of life, balance with a B, just like the Earth has had an energy balance, that's what the climate is based on. How can anybody think that that energy balance has not been totally disrupted, given the human activity that we know is occurring on our planet? And that's not just geoengineering. A lot of people want to think that that's the only thing disrupting the climate. It doesn't matter whether a particulate in the atmosphere came from a smokestack or the back of a jet. It has an effect. It affects the energy balance of the planet. And the energy balance, by the way, simply means the equilibrium of thermal energy entering the atmosphere and thermal energy leaving the atmosphere. When you begin to cover the planet with a blanket of particulates and greenhouse gases, you begin to trap more energy than can escape. That disrupts the energy balance. As I've stated before, current statistics show the planet is warming at the rate of about 4 Hiroshima bombs, the thermal energy from 4 Hiroshima bombs per second. A lot of people might hear that and think I've made a mistake in my statement. I have not made a mistake. The thermal energy of 4 Hiroshima bombs per second. That's how fast the planet's warming. That's about 400,000 a day. Please, don't believe me. Look up exactly what I said and look at the studies. They're there. They exist. And that's not a natural phenomenon. We have disrupted the energy balance. How could we not disrupt it? When we've lost over half Earth's trees, we've paved the planet, we've poisoned the oceans, and now the epitome of all human insanity, we're engineering the climate. That's maybe humanity's final folly. And there's a lot to that statement because there's been a lot of missteps by the human race. Let's take nuclear energy that some think is free energy. How free is nuclear energy? How free is Fukushima? And there's no end in sight to that nuclear volcano, by the way. No end in sight to Fukushima. There's no technology to fix that. Do we hear about that? While we're hearing headlines about NFL fans that go into tirades or some of the other ridiculous headlines that we went over earlier, how much do we hear about things like Fukushima at this point? We don't hear anything. We don't hear anything about those major events that hold life on Earth in the balance. And as bad as Fukushima is, and they say if everything goes just right, it may be another 40 years before they could control it. And they're only guessing because there's no known way to fix what's now broken. And we're building 60 more nuclear plants, by the way. People state, and I hear this often, especially in regard to climate engineering, and when we talk about the dangers, the fact we're all breathing this toxic material, it's poisoning everything, I could never count the amount of times I've heard from people to my face, they, meaning those in power, would never do this to themselves. On what does someone base that conclusion? How many things have, quote, they done to themselves already? And the nuclear issue is a huge glaring example. We have Fukushima that may eventually kill the planet, and they're building 60 more plants on the books right now. There's about 400 nuclear facilities in existence, and only one facility is enough to end it all. It's already completely in meltdown. 3 reactors through the containment vessels, it appears, melting into the core of the Earth, China syndrome, and we don't hear a thing about it. Radioactivity showing up everywhere. We had the so-called officials that are supposed to protect us and warn us of such things. What happened after Fukushima? Mysteriously, all the West Coast radiation monitoring stations were shut down. How amazing is that? People need to wake up. There's nobody out there watching the farm. In fact, official agencies, by and large, with few exceptions, are tasked with the role of hiding threats from the public. And I say that with first-hand knowledge. I've been in high-level EPA meetings, which I've mentioned before. I've studied this issue and others long enough to know. I've communicated with EPA. I'm still communicating with an EPA biological engineer who's being raked through the coals right now because he's trying to get some truth to the surface about a public threat. He's being completely ostracized from that organization and may face charges. I speak with first-hand knowledge. These organizations are tasked with hiding the threats from the public. So, back to the human race and all the things we've done to disrupt balance on the planet, balance in the atmosphere. We're through the guardrail. And not only is the human race not hitting the brakes, we're hitting the accelerator. We're stomping on the accelerator. There's no desire to slow down. Not yet. Every available resource is being poured into even more military expansion, with ever bigger and more destructive weapons sold to the highest bidder around the globe. Is that not the definition of insanity? With a biosphere that's actually imploding, the human race is pouring its energy and resources into yet more weapons of war, pouring its resources into climate engineering, flying around the planet with jets, spewing particulates out the back, under programs that are termed as solar radiation management, SRM. Look it up, please. Again, don't believe me. Look up the science on these programs. Jets that, some of them burn 1 gallon of hydrocarbon per second. 1 gallon per second. And a pound of hydrocarbon burned at atmosphere produces about 8 pounds of CO2. So in addition to the particles trapping more heat than they deflect overall, they're pumping the atmosphere full of even more CO2. And this is managing Earth's energy balance. The human race has truly lost its way. And if we look at, as the resources dwindle, as more and more energy of what's left, more and more of the resources that are left are poured into the war machine, what do empires do to try to keep that war machine going? So to weave this all back into, all this collapse that's happening right now, back into some of the ground I covered on previous shows, just to reconnect everything. Remember the chain of events. The global elite advisor, Brzezinski, his grand chessboard, his layout, his plan for toppling Middle Eastern countries, one after another. And this goes back a very long way, the grand chessboard. You can look up when this plan was outlined. And in order to do this, in order to galvanize the American population for backing these plans of destabilizing Middle Eastern countries, where the resources exist, by the way, where all the oil exists, they needed to have an event in order to cause that galvanization, in order to unite the population behind the invasions and occupations and destabilizations. Then 9/11 happened. Now, I'm simply encouraging people to look at these chains of events, come to their own conclusions. But we had think tanks like the Project for a New American Century, long before the 9/11 event actually happening, calling for, stating on their own doctrine that they needed a new Pearl Harbor to carry out their agenda of militarization and occupation. And then 9/11 happened. And then all the events around 9/11, again, if you want to know more about that issue, come to the Reading Library, 3 o'clock, Saturday the 14th, free entry, nothing's for sale, everything's free. Find out what you don't know. So 9/11 happened. Then immediately after 9/11, we have countries being invaded, starting with Iraq, who didn't have anything to do with 9/11. We know that now. The other sequence of countries follows. And also remember, before these countries were destabilized, they were droughted out with NATO weather modification programs, and this was happening in the case of Iraq even prior to 9/11. Why would that be? Were they setting up for this the whole time? Of course they were. How could they have had a plan to invade Iraq a week after 9/11? The plan was already there. This is just an execution of the plan. It's time we wake up. It's time we wake up. If there was nothing to hide in 9/11, why were so many first responders sacrificed, forced to go back into that site, told it was safe, which authorities knew, federal EPA knew was an absolute lie? 3,000 of those first responders now have some sort of cancer, but they sent them in to clean that up before anyone could actually investigate what happened. This is really, really clear. There's so many red flags here. We're simply asking for people to look at the data. And again, the film being shown at Reading Library today, 2,300 architects and engineers for truth. This is not some fringe group. These are world experts putting their career on the line, saying the official narrative is absolutely impossible based on the laws of physics. If you don't believe it, come look. Get a copy of the DVD. So, who exactly started, funded, and armed the terrorist groups, for example, in the Middle East that we've covered earlier, that helped this destabilization and caused much of this chaos? To pursue the resources. Getting back to the resources with everything I outlined earlier in this show, the collapse of the biosphere, the need for the military-industrial complex, juggernaut of insanity, to keep those wheels turning. They have to have resources, and they planned very far ahead for the moves they would need to make. The grand chessboard, again, the plan by global elite advisor Brzezinski to topple these countries. All this was laid out. It's all on the record. It's all there. Just take a look. So the terrorist groups that are operating there, like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, that we've gone over in previous shows, we now know much of that funding came from the U.S. Their Toyota trucks were funded by the Pentagon. Their weapons have been dropped to them by Western military sources. We need to wake up. We are funding terrorists. Our country is literally funding terrorists. And when Russia, and I'm not in love with Russia, believe me, Russia has lots of corruption of their own. But when Russia goes in and actually starts to bomb these terrorists, they're demonized by our country, our media, because we're the ones that set up these terrorists to topple these countries so we could put puppet governments in and control them and loot and pillage and plunder their resources, just like we've done in so many other countries around the globe. That's why there's U.S. boots on the ground in 156 countries around the globe. That's why. And I want to state again, and I try to say this always, I have great respect for our military brothers and sisters, especially those that have sacrificed all in conflicts, because I believe you did what you did for the right motives. But we need you now to wake up and understand that you are being used not for democracy, not for freedom, but to help the power structure loot, plunder, and pillage the last remaining resources on the planet so they can sustain their power and control as long as possible. You need to wake up and look around. And if you're truly a patriot, if you truly care about this country, if you truly care about the citizens of this country, you have to open your eyes, because you've taken an oath to protect this country and the citizens of this country against all threats, foreign and domestic. That's your oath. Stand up and fulfill that oath. We, the citizens of the United States, are begging you, because you are the last potential counterbalancing force on the planet, and we as citizens can't stand up against this cancer of insanity without your help. We can't. The U.S. military is the most advanced, most powerful and effective force on the planet. The U.S. citizens need that military to assist them, not to fight against them. So as everything breaks down, as chaos ensues in all these Middle Eastern countries that have been toppled in order to make occupation easier, the refugee crisis will continue to explode as nature's ability to provide for the human race is systematically destroyed. As winter sets in, the refugee situation will become even more critical, even more chaotic. And there are many engineered winter events that will go along with that. Again, we know this is happening. We absolutely know it's happening. We have the Chinese examples where they did $1 billion worth of damage to Beijing by engineering artificial snowstorms. And that was about the second or third time around over Beijing when they did $1 billion worth of damage. And engineering snowstorms means they turned what should have been rain into snow. Why? Because it cools the temperatures down in the ground, at least temporarily, at the cost of a worsened overall warming. And when the Chinese citizens of Beijing found out that this was going on, they were, of course, not very happy about it. And now the Chinese government has gone more underground with their programs, but they're absolutely at it. And by the way, so is Russia. All the major powers are at this. Again, I recently posted a long interview, still on GeoEngineeringWatch.org, that outlined the cooperation between global powers on this particular issue. Global powers that are otherwise hostile to each other are cooperating in regard to climate engineering because they've been convinced by quote-unquote scientists that engineering the climate system is the only way to keep business as usual a little longer, at the cost of killing everything in the end, of course. So we need all these countries to wake up to the fact that climate engineering will be the final nails in our collective coffins if it continues. That's a mathematical certainty on this road. Again, I state that with total conviction. It is a mathematical certainty that we face near-term global extinction on this path. And just simply look at the graphs to prove this. And even if those graphs don't become more exponential as we move forward, and they will, as I explained earlier, the graphs don't keep the same trajectories. But even if they didn't become exponential into the future, if they stayed at the current trajectory, we face certain near-term extinction. Again, we've lost 60% of Earth's wildlife in the last 40 years. Global plankton populations are now less than half of what they originally were. Plankton produces 50% to 60% of Earth's oxygen content. Boreal forests are collapsing. That's the second largest source of oxygen production on planet Earth. Atmospheric oxygen content is plummeting. This affects our health. In some of the urban areas, that oxygen content is perilously low already, in the 14-15% range, sometimes lower. It should be up at 21%. And again, as that oxygen content plummets, that affects everything in the web of life. So as the biosphere collapses and resources dwindle, what happens? What happens when there's no longer enough to go around? The law of the jungle ensues rapidly. We're there. The battle plans have long since been drawn, and the pieces on the chessboard are being put into place now. All the while, the vast majority of the populations continue to slumber. They continue to remain asleep at the wheel. Most don't have a clue what's happening around them because they don't want a clue. It's important to consider and understand this fact. The vast majority of people don't want the truth, at least not yet. They want the lie. They want to be told that this mass plunder of resources that's kept this short-term party alive is going to continue. It's not going to continue. The human race, indeed, all life on Earth, is now in a very dark place, a place from which there may be no way out. How did it get so bad? Why haven't people helped to sound the alarm? Why haven't the quote-unquote experts warned us? Why hasn't government and others warned us? Why haven't they helped us to steer the ship in a different direction? Because that's not their task in their minds. Those in power exist for their own agendas, period. The organizations they have set up in that government, the organizations that we're told are to protect public welfare, are in reality set up to mask the crimes, the destruction, the chaos that's created from these so-called governments. Again, we don't really have a country with a government. We have a government with a country. It's like mafia families with these governments around the globe. And when there's not enough to go around, those families will begin to fight. And that's close, because that's the last card they have to play. You can't hide what's happening on the biosphere much longer. Can't do it. It might seem distant for people in America, especially that have been so sheltered from what's happened around the globe over so many decades. The proverbial chickens have come home to roost. There'll be no hiding from this much longer. And because we have such corrupt, psychotic, insane people in power, that's why our government is stacked to the roof with spineless, bought and sold cowards that will do or say whatever they're told in their pitiful attempt at self-preservation. Who were the last truly respectable politicians we had? Kennedy was one. How long did he last? A week after his speech trying to expose the secret societies and the threat they posed, he was dead. What about Paul Wellstone? Many people have never heard of Paul Wellstone, senator from Minnesota, stand-up individual. But he didn't last long either. His whole family was taken out. I encourage people to search Paul Wellstone and see what happened to him. It's generally accepted on the Hill in Washington that Wellstone was taken out because he would not go along with the program. He would not go along with the criminally corrupt cancer that runs our country and our society. And when you try to communicate some of these issues, and I'm going to bring this home now to our local representative, Doug LaMalfa, whose staff, again, I've said this before, I used to communicate with about the climate engineering issue, and was actually called at home on the weekends by this staff because they were livid about it as well. And I was told that they got some sort of word, they'll deny this, but from Sacramento to let this issue go. That's what we have. We have everybody towing the line while the ship goes to the bottom. And when we have Mr. LaMalfa at certain community meetings, which I attended, trying to push the building of more dams, more water infrastructure, and so forth, while systematically ignoring the climate engineering, which is causing the drought in California, then what sort of government do we have? Ignore the real cause and simply beat the drum of whatever you're told to push to the public? That's what we have from a local level all the way to the top. That's exactly what we have. So here's an update from the forest, and I live in the forest. I've grown up in the forest, spent much of my life there. I live in the middle of it. The forest is silent right now. Where are the frogs, the birds, the bats, the bees, the bears? Very few survive. Very few. The forest is absolutely deathly silent and still. All is dying. And if you can't see this, you've either not been in the forest lately or you don't know much about the forests. But that's exactly the case. And it's happening around the globe. I haven't seen a single frog. Our home in this forest used to sound like it was in the Ozarks. There were so many frogs. It's all you could hear. I haven't seen one for months. I'm sure there's a few left. But there can't be many. There can't be many. We've lost 90% of our aquatic and terrestrial insects here in Shasta-Siskiyou counties in the last decade. 90%. This is measured by a Forest Service biologist whom I know and work with, Francis Mangels. Very honorable man. The courage to speak out. If we had more like him, we wouldn't be in this mess. If the bugs die, how long will we be here? And I realize many listening to this will roll their eyes, laugh uncomfortably, and walk away from these facts. But your denial won't change the unfolding reality. And there'll be no hiding from what's unfolding for much longer. What will it take for populations to wake from their collective coma? What will it take for people to face the issues that we now have to confront? I want to state again that I don't want anyone listening to this broadcast to believe anything I'm saying, but I hope that I can trigger the motivation to investigate without biases, without preconception. All is riding on what we do from this day on. It's up to all of us. A few of us can't win this battle to expose what needs to be exposed and to turn this ship. The greatest single leap we could take in the right direction is to expose and halt climate engineering. Make every day count. What will you do? Until next week, this is Dane Wigington with GeoEngineeringWatch.org.